Hi, this is Dale Rhoda. The topic of this short video is to give you some strategies to minimize the problems with ID variables. We want to have those variables recorded accurately on your paper forms or your electronic survey records from the very start so that the data cleaning process is easy. We have developed some resources for WHO. There's a zip file that accompanies this video. You should download that. And this video is basically an overview of the Word document that you'll find there entitled Resources to Accurately Record Survey IDs. So open that up and have a look. The problem we're addressing is that census agencies use a complicated nomenclature to ID clusters or enumeration areas. Their ID will be a concatenated set of numbers or strings because they have a nested set of real estate resources and they need to keep track of where things are. So a particular enumeration area, the ID might be a concatenated string of the subnational province. Within that province there's a district, within that district there's a village, within the village there's a subsection, and within the subsection there's an enumeration area. So the identifier for the EA, the enumeration area, might be this long ugly string in blue here. Very difficult for your field staff, survey field staff, to write this down every time they fill out a form. And the string could be even worse than the one you see here. So we recommend, first of all, that you take the string from the census agency, treat it very seriously. We want to know precisely where it is in that nomenclature, but for our survey purposes, we want to assign a simple ID. So we might assign this cluster number 1. We want to just use simple integers for the cluster IDs in our survey. And the data manager can maintain a master list that can go back and forth between these two nomenclatures. When the data will be collected on paper forms, we have a few suggestions for getting the IDs down accurately. First, you could pre-print the forms. You could use a mail merge program and you could print up forms for every stratum and cluster where those fields are pre-printed on the paper. If you know precisely how many respondents you'll have in each cluster, as might be the case in a quota sample, then this could work well. But if the number of respondents per cluster varies, this might be inefficient. So you might want to go to the second option of pre-printing some waterproof labels. Put the stratum ID and the cluster ID on the labels and pack those labels in with the packets of paper forms for each cluster. And then the teams can apply the appropriate labels to the paper forms. And another option that I've heard of is buying these adjustable rubber stamps. As you see on the slide here, you can dial in the stratum number. Perhaps you'd use one color stamp for the stratum number, one color stamp for the cluster number, and then they would be recorded very legibly and consistently in the cluster. If you're doing electronic data capture, we have some alternative suggestions. We want to recommend, first of all, that in addition to stratum ID and cluster ID, you record some additional fields that can be used for cross-checking purposes. So we want to record the ID of the interviewer and the supervisor. We want to record the date and time of the interview, which is often just captured electronically for you, as long as the clock is set correctly on your tablet. We want to collect also the electronic device ID. And we can use these auxiliary fields later to cross-check. If the cluster ID seems like it might be wrong, then we can sort by these other fields and see whether things are consistent. Was it really this interviewer that we sent to cluster number 27, or are those numbers inconsistent and they warrant more attention? If your device can record latitude and longitude, that's terrific. You can use that also for looking for consistency in the stratum IDs and the cluster IDs. But probably the strongest suggestion that we have is to use what's called a QR code. You see one printed here on the right side of the screen. You can pre-print these on paper and then scan them into the tablet, and you can use these to store the stratum ID and the cluster ID. A QR code is a block. It's much like a barcode. When it's scanned with the appropriate scanner, it resolves to a little text string. Sometimes people use them to store websites, web URLs, but this one on the right, I believe it stores the string stratum01. Go ahead and point your smartphone at the screen and see what comes back in your QR reader. So you can print those, pre-print them on the paper sheet of logistic details that you were already going to send with your team to the cluster anyway, right? Here's an example on the next slide. here's a cover sheet that you might send with the team that's going to Cluster 6 in Stratum 4. You're going to send them some driving directions. You're going to send them the name of the local contact that they'll meet with when they get there. So go ahead and also print the QR code for Stratum ID and Cluster ID. And then when you program the survey into the tablet, most survey programs these days will allow a question type of QR code. So when it comes time to enter the Stratum ID, you just point the tablet at your cover sheet and it scans the Stratum QR code and it enters the Stratum ID correctly into the software. Same thing for Cluster ID. You could do the same thing for the interviewer ID and the supervisor ID. You could provide those on printed sheets and make them QR code questions instead of questions, say, from a drop-down menu, or questions where they type the entry by hand, risking typographical errors. As I mentioned earlier, there are some additional resources in the zip file. We've given you a document with instructions to create your own QR codes and how to mail merge the QR codes onto cover sheets like the one you saw before. And we've also provided images, that 500 images that say Stratum 1, Stratum 2, etc., all the way up to Stratum 500, and 3,000 images that say Cluster 1, Cluster 2, all the way up to Cluster 3,000. So go ahead and have a look at the resources in that zip file. And if you have any questions, of course, please let us know. Thanks very much.